Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
In a ruling of huge constitutional significance, the judges of the Supreme Court have said that only Parliament can trigger the Brexit process. It's not the decision that Theresa May wanted. She'd argued that it could be done by ministers alone. The judges also said that the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland do not have to be consulted. Tonight, the BBC has learned that the government will present a Brexit bill to Parliament as early as this Thursday. And the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, had a warning for MPs. Don't use the debate in Parliament to try to stop Brexit happening. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has our first report.
A hot ticket to see judges rule. Is it the Prime Minister or Parliament that's in charge?
You're welcome. Come on in, OK.
Theresa May wanted to avoid asking MPs for permission to start leaving the EU. But businesswoman Gina Miller fought and fought and fought again.
Gina Miller, the business...
arguing the government simply does not have the power to do it alone. There's no precedent. So can our departure start, so-called Article 50,
All rise.
without Parliament saying yes?
Today, by a majority of 8-3, the Supreme Court rules that the government cannot trigger Article 50 without an Act of Parliament authorising it to do so. The referendum is of great political significance, but the Act of Parliament which established it did not say what should happen as a result. So any change in the law to give effect to the referendum must be made in the only way permitted by the UK Constitution, namely by an Act of Parliament. To proceed otherwise would be a breach of settled constitutional principles stretching back many centuries.
And there are consequences from that clear instruction. Ministers have no choice. MPs must have a say.
Of course, the government is disappointed with the outcome. But we have the good fortune to live in a country where everyone, every individual, every organisation, even government, is subject to the rule of law. So the government will comply with the judgment of the court.
The challengers, well-financed but outsiders, won the day.
No Prime Minister, no government can expect to be unanswerable or unchallenged. Parliament alone is sovereign.
The judges, crucially, did not say exactly what Parliament should do, nor did they give the Scottish, Northern Irish or Welsh administrations a formal say. The judges have ruled that the Scottish Parliament does not need to be consulted. Yes. Are you disappointed?
We were told that we had the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. It appears that that is not now the case.
Should the Prime Minister have listened to people like you in the first place?
No, well, she couldn't listen to people like me, seeing I've been saying this for 6 months.
Clear a path, please.
This melee, this court case, was never about whether or not we leave the European Union. But the verdict is not what the government wanted. They must now seek authority from just across this square before they can start the process of leaving the European Union.
Mr Johnson, is Brexit still on track?
So what next? Despite the courtroom drama, the government's been preparing for weeks. The majority of MPs have already said they will back them.
The government's priority following the European Union referendum has been to respect the outcome and to ensure it's delivered in the interest of the whole country. This House voted by 6-1 to put the decision in the hands of voters, and that bill passed the other place unopposed. So there can be no going back. The point of no return was passed on June 23rd last year.
Labour won't allow its MPs to stop the bill, but will try to make changes.
We're very clear. We're going to hold them to account. We're going to hold them to account to protect jobs. We're going to hold them to account to make sure British industry does have market access, and we're not going to allow ourselves to become some kind of offshore tax haven. That's not what people voted for.
But while MPs will have more power, the judge's decision not to insist Holyrood has a formal say could strain further the union between Scotland and the rest of the UK.
The decision is looming for Scotland. Are we prepared to allow our future to be dictated by a Westminster government that's going down a path that I think the majority of people in Scotland do not want to go down? or are we going to take our future into our own hands?
Il processo di hard Brexit.
And convinced Europeans, Lib Dems and a handful of Labour MPs might vote against Article 50 to express their fears.
Unless the government concedes a new deal for the British people, so that the British people have a say over the final arrangements between the UK and the EU, I will vote against Article 50.
But for the woman who started all of this, success, yes, after a lonely fight.
Good people didn't seem to able to stand up and put their point. So I thought if I stood up, others would join. Others would come together and we'd have a coalescing of one voice talking about this, talking about the fact that Parliament is sovereign. But no one turned up. In the 7-month process I've been through, I've been very surprised. This whole fight has been about, it's been about right and wrong. It's right that an individual citizen could bring this case. It is wrong that a government think they're above the law. And it is wrong to a government to carry on, or politicians, to carry on spinning the truth.
The Prime Minister never wanted an ugly fight in the courts. She doesn't now want weeks of angry arguments as it moves to the House of Commons. But for all its potential, this legal tangle has not strangled the government in knots. Ministers were ruled to be wrong on fundamental matters of law. But while they lost the case, the government has not lost control of the argument, at least not yet. Just as Theresa May's motorcade swept past the court, she's been able to brush aside some of the arguments. One senior Tory told me, we are on our way. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So, as we've heard, the government insists today's ruling will have no impact on the timetable for triggering talks on leaving the EU. But that depends on what happens next in Parliament. Our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, has been looking at the road ahead.
The judgment's in, now it's up to the politicians. The news went around the world in seconds, a story ministers hoped never to hear told, not in any language. But the government's had time to get ready, so could Parliament get in Theresa May's way? Here's what lies on the road ahead. The government says legislation paving the way for Brexit will be tabled within days. That'll be voted on by both houses, Commons and Lords. Theresa May intends Article 50 will be triggered by the end of March, and once triggered, Britain will have 2 years to leave the EU. One shadow minister's ready to defy Labour orders and vote against Brexit, though it might end her career.
My constituents voted to remain in the European Union. I am leaning towards voting against Article 50 because I am here to represent their views. And if I have to resign my shadow ministerial position because of the stance I take, it will be unfortunate.
Many Labour MPs accept stopping Brexit's not an option and worry their party could concede too much.
We cannot be a party that rubber stamps a hard Brexit. Look, I accept we're leaving the European Union and I'm minded to vote for Article 50 bill to be triggered, but I am not going to give this government a blank cheque on the content of a deal. I am not going to give Theresa May the ability to go and run a coach and horses through the living standards of middle and lower income families in my constituency. I won't do it.
Around Westminster, people are wondering who'll work with whom. The SNP, like the Lib Dems, feel they need more help in the battle of Brexit.
What we really need is to be working together with as many people as possible to hold this government to account. And I think we really need Labour to get their act together a bit.
Opposition parties are split, and Labour, out of step with so many of its Brexit-supporting voters, can't agree on tactics or policy, and that's good news for Theresa May. The bill to start Britain's EU divorce proceedings will pass, and comfortably. In the Commons, MPs will try to force more votes before the divorce deal is settled, and in the Lords, there'll be more resistance to Brexit. But many peers are nervous about defying the verdict of the EU referendum.
Would it not be foolish in the extreme if this House placed itself as an unelected body in confrontation with the bulk of the British people?
For keen Brexiteers today, so far so good. You're looking a little bit triumphant right now.
Well, I'm happy that we didn't end up with a bogged-down deal over the devolved administrations, instead of which a simple process, a simple bill going through both houses. Theresa May will be on time, triggering Article 50, she's made it clear, which means, basically, the effort to try and stop us leaving has failed.
So another long day on the road to Brexit. The bill approving the exit talks comes out on Thursday, but this is just the beginning. The real political slog towards an EU deal has yet to begin. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
So tonight there could be trouble ahead for the government at Westminster and in Scotland. In a moment we'll hear from Laura Koonsberg, but first our Scotland editor Sarah Smith is at Holyrood. Sarah, we've heard the anger and the disappointment from the SNP, but what more realistically can Nicola Sturgeon do?
Well, even though the Supreme Court ruled that there does not have to be a vote in the Scottish Parliament, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has announced that she's going to go ahead and call one anyway. And that vote will give MSPs a chance here at Holyrood to vote against triggering Article 50, something they are very likely to do, reflecting the fact that 62% of the Scottish electorate voted to remain in the EU. Now, that vote won't have any legal standing. The Scottish Parliament cannot stop the UK government from going ahead with its Brexit plans, but the SNP do hope it will be highly significant politically, because it will help them to bolster their argument that the Prime Minister isn't listening to Scottish wishes. Nicola Sturgeon has said again today that a decision is looming on when Scotland might want to take control of its own future. In other words, she's warning again that she might call for another Scottish independence referendum, and she'll be hoping that yet another argument with Westminster could bolster and build the case for Scottish independence.
All right, Laura, let me come to you now at Westminster. As you said, this isn't the decision Theresa May wanted, but what do you think is the mood amongst ministers tonight?
Well, George, something slightly strange has happened in a sense. The government lost today in a monumental legal case that will go down in constitutional history. It will be remembered forever and discussed by lawyers and academics and all the rest of it. But the government was defeated, but actually tonight they're feeling rather chipper. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they don't have to deal with what they feared, a hugely complicated battle between Westminster and Holyrood over how they had to involve the devolved administrations, and also because the court wasn't extremely forthright and explicit in trying to force them to publish encyclopedias of information about how they plan to proceed. So they are being asked, in their view, really to do the minimum that the court has required them to do, and that in itself is a relief that has put them in a pretty good mood. And it means they are going to proceed, we think, on Thursday with legislation, probably only a couple of lines of a government bill, proceeding at great speed with the hope of wrapping it all up in the House of Commons within a fortnight. Now, none of this means that over the next couple of years there isn't going to be enormous political trouble ahead, huge battles and fight between the government and backbenchers, government and the opposition, and of course, crucially, between Theresa May and the other countries in the European Union. But so far, in terms of this huge case that could have caused such huge trouble, Theresa May's team do feel that even though they lost, there is something of a victory about today.
OK, Laura at Westminster and Sarah at Holyrood, thank you both very much. So, as we've heard, today's ruling goes to the heart of how British democracy works. Let's get a view now from our legal affairs correspondent, Clive Coleman. We've heard there from both Sarah and Laura the political significance of what's been going on today. But in legal terms, what's your judgment?
Well, Gina Miller's case really defines the limits of executive of government power, and it underscores the core principle at the heart of our unwritten constitution, that Parliament is sovereign, Parliament creates the law, and it is only Parliament that can change that law. Now, although this case was really about where power lies as between ministers and Parliament, it also points up the importance and the role of the independent judiciary, because through a judicial review brought by 2 citizens, judges were able to stop the vast machinery of government in its tracks, because what ministers were proposing to do was unlawful. Now, the late Judge Lord Denning said, "Be you ever so mighty, the law is above you." And this case also demonstrates judges applying another vital principle, which is that nobody, not even the government, is above the law. Now, some regard our judges as unelected and unaccountable. One newspaper even dubbed them as enemies of the people. But for many others, George, they remain a vital check and balance against the misuse of power by ministers and by the state.
All right, Clive, thank you very much.
The government's Brexit plan was dealt a bloody nose today after it was defeated in a landmark ruling at the Supreme Court. Judges said Parliament must give its approval before the formal process of leaving the EU is triggered. Well, the decision was welcomed by campaigners who brought the case, but it was far from a knockout blow. The government has promised a Brexit bill within days and insists there is no going back. Our political editor Robert Peston on the ruling and the reaction.
Theresa May, used to getting it pretty much all her own way since becoming Prime Minister in July. But this businesswoman, Gina Miller, has succeeded where Labour Party and press has failed. She forced a dramatic change of government policy by taking the PM to court.
All rise.
And here are the judges in the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, ruling on whether the Prime Minister has the exclusive power to take us out of the European Union under so-called Article 50, or whether she needs the approval of MPs and Lords.
Today, by a majority of 8 to 3, the Supreme Court rules that the government cannot trigger Article 50 without an Act of Parliament authorising it to do so.
So here's the winner in disgruntled people versus government, Gina Miller.
No government can expect to be unanswerable or unchallenged. Parliament alone is sovereign. This ruling today means that MPs we have elected will rightfully have the opportunity to bring their invaluable experience and expertise to bear in helping the government select the best course in the forthcoming Brexit negotiations.
Due to her defeat, the government will now present a bill authorising Brexit talks in just the next few days, so that she can trigger the process of leaving the EU under Article 50 by the end of March. That would kick off 2 years of talks prior to the formal date of departure in March 2019.
This timetable has already been supported by this House.
The Brexit minister was flanked by a Prime Minister who didn't look as though she thought the judges had given her a lovely present.
This judgment does not change the fact that the UK will be leaving the European Union, and it's our job to deliver on the instruction the people of the UK have given us. I trust no one will seek to make it a vehicle for attempts to thwart the will of the people or frustrate or delay the process of exit the European Union.
But even on his and the Prime Minister's side of the House, they want more information.
I would like a white paper which we could debate. It will bring us together, I would say to my right honourable friend.
So, will he be Theresa May's Brexit friend or foe?
We will allow Article 50 to be triggered because that is the result of the referendum. We will be holding them to the utmost scrutiny and account on every single phase of this process.
When it comes to that vote, 3-line whip?
I seek to persuade. I do my best to ask colleagues to come along with me.
Here at the Supreme Court, they say what the law means. Now MPs and Lords have to make a new law to begin the process of taking us out of the EU and just possibly constrain the way that Theresa May does it, which she won't like one little bit. Robert Peston, ITV News.
Well, Supreme Court judges also ruled today on who can't vote on triggering the start of Brexit. Regional governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland do not, it said, need to be consulted. But the devolved nations said that showed they're not being treated as equals. Well, in a moment we'll hear from voters in Wales. But first we get the view from people and politicians in Scotland.
My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June.
As Scotland's capital prepares to celebrate Robert Burns Day, it is a reminder that this proud nation has long had its own distinct traditions and voice. After today's court ruling, though, there's a growing feeling that voice is being drowned out.
Considering the majority of Scotland voted to remain, I think it's a real shame that we're not going to get a say in the matter.
From the Scottish Parliament?
From the Scottish Parliament.
I think it's totally undemocratic and unfair. I mean, the Scottish Parliament should have a say.
But some here will tell you it's time Scotland started singing from the same hymn sheet as the rest of Britain.
I myself would have voted to remain in the EU, but at the same time, we are one country and Scotland and England and Northern Ireland and Wales voted to leave, and that's democracy.
Every time somebody gets a vote against them, they want to change the ruling and have another one.
And there could well be another vote. The First Minister here thinks Indy Ref 2 is more and more likely.
Are we happy to allow our future to be dictated by a Westminster government with one MP in Scotland, or is it time to take our future into our own hands?
For Auld Lang Syne.
Scotland does have a say in the Brexit vote at Westminster through its 59 elected MPs. They are a minority though, and there's no obligation on the rest of the Parliament to listen. Peter Smith, ITV News, Edinburgh.
At the Breakers Yard in Cardiff, there's a lifetime's experience of dismantling machinery. Wales wanted out, and Westminster is in the driving seat. That's not a position that worries everybody here.
Well, I think things are going to be a lot better, to be true for you. That's what I really think. And it's left to them up there. You ought to know what they're doing, they're getting paid for doing it, so let them crack on and do it, innit?
But others simply hope that politicians will unite.
Work together. That'd be better, wouldn't it? If we work together, and we're guessing with them, like.
But the Danish bakery business is brisk, and more than anything, there's an appetite for an end to uncertainty.
If you could just get on with it, let us know what's going to hit us, we can deal with it. But the whole guessing and doing little steps forward all the time is actually quite unnerving for everyone.
Politicians are cut out by the law, but still fighting.
Do you feel just a little less powerful today than you did yesterday?
Well, I wouldn't put it in those terms. I think the point is about the rights of the people in Wales to have their voices heard through their elected representatives. That's what we're seeking to establish here. That's just a basic question of democracy as far as we're concerned.
Some in Wales feel their future hangs in the balance, but this is uncharted territory, and predicting how the break pans out is a dangerous business. Rupert Evelyn, ITV News, Cardiff.
Well, let's return now to our political editor, Robert Peston. Robert, how much of a problem is today's ruling then for the government?
Well, look, it's not a good look for any Prime Minister to be overruled by judges. And to be absolutely clear, Theresa May wanted a free hand in Brexit talks. She's not going to get it. But this place, Parliament, will give her the authorisation she wants to start those Brexit talks in April. And from that point of view, people would say, well, what's all the fuss about? Well, the fact is that MPs will attempt to tie her hands a bit. They want more information in the form of a white paper. They want to make sure that the vote at the end of the 2-year process is one that is meaningful, that doesn't effectively mean that they have a choice between a bad deal and a terrible deal. So the government is anxious about all of this, but to be absolutely clear, they will have an overwhelming majority in favour of starting Brexit negotiations because most Labour MPs will vote with the government.
OK, Robert Peston in the House of Commons, thank you.
If you thought the arguments over Brexit would end after the referendum, sorry, it's not over, and the Supreme Court has invited the arguments to continue in the Commons and perhaps more crucially now in the House of Lords. Then there's Scotland. The court didn't give the government there any power over Brexit, but the SNP are not going to accept Theresa May's version of it quietly. Now, it's not clear who will actually have the muscle to block or delay Brexit, and the bookies still think Article 50 will probably be triggered before the end of March. But there is a chance it'll get messy. Our policy editor, Chris Cook, is good at making sense of a mess. Here's how he thinks things might pan out.
All rise. It's official. To invoke Article 50, Downing Street won't need to consult the devolved governments, but will need to pass a bill through Parliament.
In broad terms, Article 50 provides that a country wishing to leave the EU must give a notice in accordance with its own constitutional requirements.
Right now, that doesn't look like a serious problem for ministers. The first stage then in the Article 50 process is taking a bill into the House of Commons. Now, the fundamental fact about the lower house of Parliament is there's a Conservative majority. They've got the votes. So yes, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats might cause trouble for the government, but fundamentally they won't succeed. The only changes that people are really looking for or hoping for from the lower house are really quite narrowly procedural.
Mr. Speaker.
Here, for example, is Labour's position.
Labour accepts and respects the referendum result and will not frustrate the process. But we will be seeking to lay amendments to ensure proper scrutiny and accountability throughout the process. That starts, Mr. Speaker, with a white paper or plan.
The government hopes that the bill will be through the Commons by February the 9th, when it rises for its next recess. Then it's off to the House of Lords, which is where it's likely to have a tougher time. Remember, the government doesn't have a majority in the upper house. But any problems there are likely to take the form of unhelpful amendments and perhaps a bit of delay, not outright blocking.
On big items, the House of Lords is often restrained by the fact that there was a commitment in a manifesto, and by convention the House of Lords doesn't oppose manifesto commitments. But this time, while there was a commitment to a referendum, there certainly wasn't a commitment to take the UK out of the single market. So some members at least will see that as giving them licence to challenge the government. But ultimately the House of Lords probably won't want to be seen to be frustrating the will of the British people as expressed in the referendum result last year.
Now, the government says that Parliament will get another opportunity to vote on the deal that it gets from Europe at the end of the process. But whether that's an opportunity for Parliament to really scrutinise what's going on and suggest changes depends on precisely when the government comes back for that vote.
The draft deal has to come back before it's been signed, because Parliament could look at it and either say that's fine or it's mostly fine but this isn't, can you go back and see if you can get something different or better on this. It's important that it comes at that stage rather than Parliament being asked take it or leave it at the 11th hour. I don't think that would be acceptable.
Given our rulers haven't much been constrained, perhaps the biggest question today is why they took this case to the Supreme Court at all.
Chris Cook. Well, the Scottish Government does not have and has not sought a veto over Brexit. Thanks to the Supreme Court, we now know there's no requirement for a vote in the devolved parliaments or assemblies, but the Scottish Parliament is going to have a vote anyway. Well, earlier I spoke to Alex Salmond, former First Minister, SNP Foreign Affairs spokesman. Now today he has said Downing Street must treat the devolved administrations as equal partners in the Brexit process, quote, as she promised to do. Well, I asked where Theresa May did make such a promise.
What they said, what she and the Tory party have said, is that Scotland is an equal partner within the United Kingdom. Actually, the phrase, not from Theresa May, but from her predecessor, was Scotland should lead the United Kingdom, not leave the United Kingdom. But the phrase equal partnership has been used by the Conservative Party, that Scotland is an equal partner within the United Kingdom. If you're an equal partner within the United Kingdom, then your views on something as substantial and far-reaching as Brexit deserve to be taken on account on an equal basis.
Well,
what Theresa May said, of course,
it was one person, one vote in Scotland, as it was everywhere else in the country. A Scottish person was equal to everywhere else.
But Scotland is a country, not a county. And the Scottish nation voted decisively to stay within the European Union. But of course it was Theresa May who said explicitly the week after she became Prime Minister, when she went to visit Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, she said she wanted an agreed position across the United Kingdom. Now, you can't have an agreed position unless you're prepared to consult people on an equal basis.
Well, she's consulting, but I don't think it was ever understood that the Scottish administration would have equal say in an issue of customs union, immigration policy, foreign policy, international treaties, as the government of the United Kingdom, in which the people of Scotland have a large shaping part, because they vote in UK general elections, obviously.
The vote in favour of staying in the European Union was 62%. Right. The vote in favour of the United Kingdom was 55%. Far more people in Scotland, by majority and percentage, wanted to stay within Europe as wanted to stay within the United Kingdom. And as you'll remember, in 2014, one of the cardinal arguments of the No campaign, though people argue against independence, was that we'd stay in Europe if we voted against Scottish independence. Now, I know it's ridiculous now, it looks absurd, but that was one of the key arguments of the No campaign. And more to the point, of course, Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, stood in a manifesto commitment last year and was re-elected on the basis that if Scotland was dragged out of Europe against the will of the Scottish people, then the Scottish Parliament would have the right to call an independence referendum.
Well, that brings me, I suppose, to what is the big question for the SNP today. It's got to be the big question for the SNP. Why don't you just call a referendum? You're not going to learn anything between now and Brexit. We know what the British government's policy on Brexit is. It's been stated by Theresa May as clearly as anything. We know that Scotland is not going to remain in the single market as the Scottish government hopes. We know that Britain is not even going to try and stay in the single market. What else do you need to trigger a referendum?
Well, let's go through the parliamentary process as far as the single market's concerned. The UK government is still to respond officially to the Scottish Government's compromise proposal that if England is determined to leave the single market, then Scotland could stay in the single market. There's working examples elsewhere in Europe where this is the case. Why shouldn't that be considered as a reasonable proposal? But if at the end of the day, Theresa May is not interested in staying in the single market, she's not interested in respecting the wishes of the people of Scotland to stay within the single market, maintain jobs and investment, then of course, if she flings down that gauntlet, then I fully expect Nicola Sturgeon to pick it up.
Well, then we do expect a referendum, because she's not going to give you different status within the single market. There are all sorts of practical challenges and difficulties around free movement of that. Well, but the difficulty is that we won't have...
Let me just examine that point. That is not true. There actually is a working example in Europe at the present moment of a country which has a monetary and a customs union with another country, and one is within the single market and one isn't. That's Liechtenstein and Switzerland. If you intend to implement control of labour at the workplace through a green card system, as Theresa May does, there is no impediment whatsoever to Scotland being within the single market while England is not. It is a practical proposition. It is, of course, has complexities, but anything about Brexit has complexities. And this is a practical proposition. So you dismiss this. Why shouldn't the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom pay attention to the wishes of the Scottish people, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government?
I'm, I suppose, curious as to why you're offering this rather complicated, and it would be complicated, this rather complicated settlement when there's a much simpler one facing you, which is to call a referendum and just let the Scottish people decide. Is it the UK? Is it the EU? What is it that the Scottish people want? Why are you? Is it because the polls are against you that you're not going to do it?
Right. Okay. Well, let's take these points in turn. It's nothing like as complicated as the Brexit process. Believe me, that will be complicated. There's already going to be, we know, special deals for Northern Ireland, for the Channel Islands, for Gibraltar, perhaps even for the City of London, for the car industry in Sunderland. And if there can be a special deal for the car industry in Sunderland, then I think there might be a special deal for the nation of Scotland. But if the Prime Minister at the end of the day doesn't want to accede to any of these reasonable compromise proposals from Nicola Sturgeon, then as Nicola Sturgeon has rightly said, an independence referendum becomes very likely and will take place within the next 2 years. And as for the support for it, there's been 16 polls since the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. 15 of these polls have shown support at a higher level than the 45% recorded in September 2014.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a poll that 62% of Scottish people don't want another independent referendum.
Yes, I saw that poll as well. The question was, wanted a referendum in 2017. I would vote against the referendum this year, as indeed would Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon's proposition in these circumstances, with her compromise proposal rejected, is to have a referendum within the negotiating period of 2 years.
Would you accept that if there's another referendum, that really is it? That's best of three. You can't even win on a best of three at that stage. So if it's 2-0, it's over. And this time, really, it is over for 30, 50 years. It can't come back again for decades.
Well, let me say this. If the Prime Minister decides to ignore the, I think, over substantial demand in the UK as a whole to stay within the single marketplace, if she then decides to ignore the wishes of Scotland to maintain our 1,000-year connection and history with Europe as a European nation, in that context, if there's a referendum within the next 2 years, then the yes side will win.
Alex Salmond, nice talking to you. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Alex Salmond there. Well, for some reason, it is perhaps Labour that is struggling with the consequences of this Supreme Court verdict as much as the government. If Parliament is to vote, then Labour has to make up its mind as to exactly what its position is. And yet it has given a good impression of being in a muddle. Keen to support Brexit, as that was the result of the referendum, but also having lots of Remain supporters it can't ignore. It's kind of stuck between UKIP in some blue-collar neighbourhoods and the Lib Dems in university towns. Well, Nick Watt's been looking at where the party stands.
For the best part of 3 decades, Europe has cast a shadow over the Conservative Party.
Now, at the very moment many Tories have been expecting a split of historic proportions, it is the Labour Party which is wrestling with this most troublesome of issues. The vast bulk of the Conservative Party accepts Theresa May's timetable for triggering Article 50 and her overall Brexit blueprint. As for the Labour Party, they are struggling to fashion a coherent response. Many Labour MPs are also trying to work out how to adapt their instinctively pro-EU views whilst representing constituencies which recorded high Leave votes in the referendum.
I campaigned passionately for Remain. I lived and worked in Brussels for a number of years. I'm married to a Dane and all the rest of it. So I'm pro-European with my heart and my head. But I'm also a Democrat. The referendum has overridden the way that I would normally look at the European question. And now we have to accept the reality of where we are and push the government to secure the best possible deal for the British people.
It was but half a generation ago that Labour's fervent support for the EU was an electoral asset. Now the referendum has changed everything, presenting Labour with a daunting challenge.
Labour's never going to appeal to people who are fervently pro-European and die-hard Brexiteers. It's got to try and change the terms of the political conversation, reach out to people who didn't feel hugely strongly in either direction. And that really means not talking about Brexit anymore. While the conversation is about Brexit, Labour's in a strategically weak position.
Andrew Harrop believes a weakened Labour Party is providing rich pickings for other parties. Since the 2015 general election, it's estimated that Labour has lost the highest number of votes to the Lib Dems, 400,000. However, it's also lost 200,000 votes to the Conservatives and 200,000 to UKIP.
The Labour Party in complete disarray. They don't know what they think. You talk to a dozen different Labour MPs on the issue, you get a dozen different answers. Labour Party should be getting behind voting to trigger Article 50, but I've been speaking to some even today who say they're still going to try and frustrate the process.
One unlikely voice sympathises with Labour.
I'm relatively sympathetic to Jeremy Corbyn in the position he finds himself, because I think he is finding problems that any Labour leader would find, and they are not specific to him. He is a symptom, not a cause, of the division, with the London voters thinking one thing and broadly the northern voters thinking another.
Jacob Rees-Mogg believes his party has an opportunity unprecedented in the modern era.
The Conservative Party is probably more united on Europe than it has been since the days of Anthony Eden. And Mrs May is in the fortunate position of having less opposition than almost any Conservative leader, probably in history, that she has a united party. There's no internal opposition.
Stephen Kinnock believes all may not be lost for his party.
The government has a mandate to take the UK out of the European Union. They do not, in my view, have a mandate to turn us into some sort of European version of the Cayman Islands. Brexit is not an excuse for making a bonfire of workers' rights, a bonfire of environmental rights, of slashing the minimum wage, slashing corporation tax, deconstructing the welfare state that this country is built on. This government does not have a mandate to do that, so our job is to draw those battle lines.
In the space of a few years, the UK has experienced 2 landmark referendums, and it has been Labour which has faced acute challenges in their aftermath. The party will be hoping that the shadow cast by Brexit will lift, although ironically it may take a definitive break with the EU to allow Labour to return to more natural terrain.
Nick Watt, well, I'm joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry. Thank you very much for coming in. Look, I know what the Lib Dems think about the EU. UKIP writes itself, and I know where Theresa May stands. I would find it hard to say where Labour stands at the moment. Just in a couple of sentences, what's your policy?
Firstly, do you really know where the Lib Dems stand? They've only got a group of 9, and the last time they had to vote on Article 50, half of them voted one way and the other half abstained.
They want to stay in and they want a second referendum.
Well, that's
you
what
don't want
them
but they
today.
are very keen to stay in. Now,
Anyway.
what's in 2 sentences? what is Labour's position on what happens now? Not on the process, but on what we want, where we want to be.
Our position is this, that the British people have spoken, we have our instructions, we have to make sure that we get the best possible deal. We believe the best possible deal begins with the economy. Nobody voted, whether they voted to remain or to leave, to be poorer or to lose their job.
And that, on that point, you are no different to Theresa May, because she believes we want as much market access as we can get, we want investment. Now, she is not willing to pay the price for that market access by giving up control of our borders. Are you saying you would have less control of the borders than Theresa May is advocating?
I think there are definitely differences in terms of emphasis, but I think that the speech that she made was she was trying to ride two horses at once that were going in two different directions. And it is our job as the opposition, and remember, we are only the opposition, we have to hold her to account. There are bits in her speech we like. So we like the idea of a tariff-free access to the single market. We like there not being a build-up of red tape. That's the sort of thing we like to hear. So yes, we will support her on that, and we want to make sure that the negotiations go that way. But when she talks about some kind of weird new customs union entirely built for Britain, or when she says, if we don't get this deal, then we're going to become a completely different country, we're going to break the economic model. This is what she said.
Yeah.
She said she wanted to break the economic model. She said she wanted to attract businesses.
She didn't want to, that was the backup plan.
No, all right, okay. She threatened something, she can only threaten it if she means it, and what she means is if she doesn't get her own way, she's going to try and attract businesses here by lowering corporation tax and by making it more attractive. That means less money for services.
Understand.
You know,
so that critique I've heard. I suppose I really want to know.
You don't know what we say.
No, but I know what your critique of her is. What I want to know is basically the question is there an alternative vision to Brexit, to the one that says we get control of our border back, we leave the single market, we leave the customs union, and we just fight for as much access as we can get after that? Now, that sounds to me as that's what your position is. You're not saying we'll have free movement, so we are going to leave the free market, the single market.
No. What we're saying is that our first principle, what is most important, is that we look after the economy. What's most important for any government is the safety and security of its citizens,
and
the
then
second is the economy.
So
now,
you would have free movement, because all the economists will tell you is free movement is the price you pay to get the best market access, and the best market access is good for the economy. So
if we're not going to be in the single market, and we're going to have a custom-made deal for Britain, then there will need to be negotiating, and we've made it clear that we will not die in a ditch for freedom of movement. There needs to be some give and take on this, but our priority is to make sure that nobody loses their job and that we look after the economy. Because our people, because people who are just keeping their head above water will be the ones who will be affected most if the economy goes back. Well, this is entirely consistent with Labour values.
I understand, but I'm not entirely clear as to the trade-off between market access, let's call that good for the economy, and control of borders, which allows us to control immigration. I'm not 100% clear where you are on that. Look, let's suppose you've knocked on my door. I'm a member of the public, you've knocked on the door, and I say, here, Emily Thornberry, tell me what your policy on Europe is. Now, give it to me in a punter-friendly style.
Well, I've just told you. Do you want me to say it all over again?
Right. So it's priority to the economy. What about immigration? What's the policy on immigration?
Our policy on immigration is that we will not die in a ditch for freedom of movement.
That's not we won't die in a ditch. Are you for us or against it?
It will be a negotiation.
You're for free movement or you're against free movement? You're not dying in a ditch implies you want it, but you're not going to...
We're not against immigration. We have always been in favour of fair rules and managed migration. That has always been Labour's policy, and it continues to be Labour's policy.
So you're in favour of free movement, but you're not going to die in a ditch for it. But the EU wants us to have free movement, so not dying in a ditch for it is going to be easy to negotiate. You will keep it and get good market access.
Now, do you know what? We're not going to be doing the negotiations. Unfortunately, we're in opposition. And so our job is to make sure that this government does not lose sight of the overwhelming importance of jobs and living standards and the economy. We do not need them to, we do not trust them to go off on their own and negotiate on our behalf in Europe without us keeping an eye on them. And that's why today what we were saying was that, that the Article 50, if it's going to be triggered, we will not get in the way of it, but we will try and amend the legislation in order to ensure that they keep coming back, that we keep an eye on it, and if necessary, there'll be hand-to-hand combat on this. We need to make sure that we get the best deal on behalf of the whole country. And she can't say she acts on behalf of the whole country without actually negotiating with Parliament, without listening to Parliament, without listening to the views of the British people. We represent important parts of Britain. Actually, you know, people say, oh, Labour's in such difficulties. We've got, you know, people who are in favour of leaving the European and people who want to leave the Union. You know, actually, we represent the country. I mean, the fact is that we have a...
And they represent more of it because they've got more votes.
Yeah, but the mixture of views within the Labour Party reflects the views in the... Yeah. And so actually, you know, the way in which we're thinking about this with a little more depth, I think, than the Tories are, is a good thing. And we can contribute and we can help, but they do need to listen.
Very positive spin on the division.
But it's not a spin, it's simply the truth.
Right. One of the things you've been... the lines today has been you will not let the government turn Britain into an offshore Cayman Islands.
Damn right we won't.
Is that going to be an amendment to the Article 50 bill? Is there going to be something to that effect?
Let's see what the bill is first.
Right.
It's really difficult for me to tell you.
It's going to be a couple of lines, probably, isn't it? It's going to be on Thursday.
Maybe and maybe not. Let's see what
there's no point now, is there? You could put an amendment saying Britain mustn't become a tax haven or Britain mustn't aim to reduce its...
Well, we may not be allowed to put it in exactly those words.
But there's no point anyway, because a future government can just change its mind on that. It's not a negotiating thing with the EU.
But there'll be a number of things, right? Okay. So the first thing is, the plan, it may be a piece of paper with plan written on the top, but it's a speech that she didn't make in Parliament and she wasn't answerable to questions. Right. And so we want to have a white paper, first thing. We want to have a clear plan so that we can look at exactly what it is, so that we can hold them to account. If that's what she says she wants to do, she's promising everything to everyone. Let's have it written down and let's hold her to it. Let's scrutinise. That's number one. Number two is, what are the broad principles? What are the broad principles when you're negotiating? We want to be able to set some lines in the sand. This you should be doing, this you... And then, most importantly, is the accountability. So as you go along, you must keep reporting back. We should hold you to account, and that final vote should not be at the 11th hour when it's basically take it or leave it.
All process stuff, process. But that's, I mean, that's interesting. But if there's not really much difference between you and them,
there is a difference. There is a lot of difference between our approach and the Tories' approach. I really think.
Do you accept? I mean, one of the difficulties for Labour is that basically the country's great schism is Remain a Brexit. And opposition that is trying to be kind of, well, we accept the Brexit result. It puts you in a very difficult position because, in a sense, you're not on the great fissure, on either side of the great fissure in politics.
No, in the end, you know, you cannot have political parties who go for one half or the other half, which is what the other two parties are doing. Actually, the fact that we are trying to bring the country together under the principle that we need to look after the economy and we need to get the best deal on behalf of the whole country is something that we can unify the country around. We're not going to chase 48%. We're not going to chase an extreme part of 52%. We're going to do our utmost to ensure that we stand up for the whole country and we should be listened to, and we're going to make sure that we are.
Emily Thornberry, thanks very much. Thanks. Well, let's take ourselves to the end of the programme by reflecting on the story of the day, that Supreme Court verdict and the path to Brexit, which is, well, perhaps disrupting British politics. I'm joined in the studio by author and journalist Sonia Purnell and The Sun's political editor Tom Newton-Dunn, and from New York, just happens to be there, by The Guardian columnist Owen Jones. Thanks all very much for coming in. Owen, let's start with you, because we've been talking a lot about Labour tonight and the problems of Labour. Do you get a bit depressed that the kind of left-right schism in the country just seems to have been blown apart by the Brexit Remain schism? And in a way, Jeremy Corbyn's whole raison d'etre, his whole point of being there to sort of bring a left-wing populism to the people is just not really being heard at all.
Depressed about politics? Me? Nothing to be depressed about at the moment. I think, look, clearly we have a very divided country. It's polarised on an issue which will dominate British politics for a very long time. And I think the unique problem, I mean, of all people, my good pal Jacob Rees-Mogg alludes to this, the unique problem Labour has is it has in its electoral coalition the likes of people who live in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Liverpool, who feel very traumatised in the aftermath of the EU referendum. They think it's all a bad dream and they want it to go away. You've got other Labour voters, for example, in Doncaster, Oldham, Burnley, who feel they've got their country back. And it's very difficult to reconcile those two very different perspectives. And often, because Brexit is a fisher line, it's not just about the EU. In fact, if anything, the EU's kind of long down the list, in terms of what the EU referendum conjured up on everything like immigration and multiculturalism, on other kind of social issues, I suppose, where you get two groups of people with quite different outlooks on life and different priorities. And, it is difficult when you want a Labour opposition to have a clear kind of take on the people at the top, the vested interests, talk about tax justice, investment rather than cuts. But Owen, instead talking about... Sorry, go for it.
Does it not make you perhaps worry that the coalition that is the Labour Party, that particular one, is just outlived, is past its sell-by date now? It doesn't work because the two groups in it just simply don't agree with each other on all the sort of relevant and big issues of the day.
No, it just needs to adapt. I mean, look, this isn't a British problem. All over Europe, as you know, social democracy is in crisis. And, and it doesn't matter if the leaders of these parties are on the left or the right. In Germany, for example, the Labour sister party, the German Social Democrats, their leader supports third-way Blairite-style politics. He's on 20% in the opinion polls. I mean, he'd probably be envious of Labour's terrible polling in this country. There are very few countries where it's doing well. So clearly the left has to adapt. And often you get now, across Europe, the old kind of so-called centre-left and a rising radical left who are arguing with each other and very angry with each other. But that's often displaced fury from both wings at their own lack of a clear route to power, a clear vision and a clear strategy. And all sections, if you believe in a different sort of Britain or a different sort of Europe, all those other countries, there is a big kind of ask now about how you build a broad coalition, and that coalition has changed a huge amount. It's not the old industrial working class anymore, a service sector working class, hire and fire, more people going to university. It's tough, but it can be done. Of course it can.
Let me put that to the others. I mean, Sonia, are you selling your shares in Labour at the moment?
I would do, but I think really what we have is a complete vacuum of leadership. I think they have got to decide whether they're on one side of the fissure or the other. They've got to be brave. They've got to then decide what they're going to do and then stick to it and fight for it and vote accordingly in Parliament. I mean, the Supreme Court today said, right, it's up to you now, politicians, to take this forward. It very much is so. It is now up to Parliament to make a decision. MPs are not delegates, they're representatives. They're not legally bound to vote this way or the other. They should vote with their conscience. And I do think the leadership of the party should allow them to do so.
Tom, have you got any advice for Labour? Not your sort of usual thing, I know, but...
Very happy to offer advice to anyone who asks, even you, Evan. I think Sonia's absolutely right. They will be in a terrible mess for as long as they try, as Owen pointed out, to straddle this giant fissure. It is literally unstraddleable.
But if they give up one side of it, they're going to lose half their market, aren't they? And that's quite tricky. That's a brave choice.
And funny thing, we've seen this before. The Scottish referendum, as Nick Watt pointed out in his package very well, by really almost no fault of their own, they've been split in two by two giant referendums in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think what Labour really do need to try and realise is the existential threat that's going on here. This is not just a problem that may resolve itself in a few weeks or months' time with a few cheeky little votes in Parliament. There's a poll out tonight for the Stoke by-election done by Labour Leave, the John Mills-sponsored Labour outfit wanted to get out of the EU. On the first ever one on the Stoke by-election, it has Paul Nuttall, the leader of UKIP, 10 points ahead already. As we know, the election is going to be in about a week's time.
If you want a list of the other candidates in that by-election or the so far selected candidates, you can go to the BBC website for that.
Very BBC.
A 10-point lead for Paul Nuttall.
10-point lead, and so he's on something like 35%, Labour on 25%, and 80% of his support have come from Labour voters.
Do we believe this contention that Remain Brexit is the fissure that divides the nation at the moment, more than left, right, or other things? Because I know that it feels like in the circles I mix in that it is. But I mix in quite sort of politically engaged circles. I wonder whether out there are lots of people who really don't much
Well, I think there was another poll today, wasn't there, saying that more people were concerned with what was happening in the NHS than they were with Brexit. But I think all these issues get conflated, don't they? And I think, again, you just go back to leadership. And I think you need a leader of the Labour Party or whichever party perhaps will now replace it to take a position, to stick at it, and then say this would be better for the NHS, this would be better for employment or whatever it is. We don't have that at the moment. We have no opposition.
Before I go back to Owen, where have all the Tory Remainers gone? I mean, when you had Brexiteers in the Tory party, they were very noisy. The Remainers, why are they acquiescing so much in the Tory party?
I wouldn't call it acquiescing. I think they're biding their time. Their numbers are still strong. There aren't just one or two of them brave enough to stick their heads above the parapet and give David Davis a hard time like I did in the Commons today. I'd say there's 40, 50, possibly 60, 70 of them. Remember the likes of George Osborne. A lot of people remain silent because they know now is the wrong time to start waving their flag. Theresa May has the country behind her, the momentum behind her. This is going to get a lot more difficult for her. We've only just.
You think it's going to get more difficult to you? Because at the moment it feels like she's making all the running. She's got the clearest view. She's
so. This is just the early skirmishes of what is going to be a giant warfare.
And do you agree with that, Sonia?
Well, I think what Theresa May has done is made sort of the whole Brexit thing like a cult. And if you don't belong to it and don't subscribe to it, you're shunned. You don't get on telly. You don't get asked to parties. You're sort of excluded socially and politically and all the rest of it. And I think that actually a lot of people are afraid to stick their heads up above the parapet.
Owen, are you optimistic for a post-Brexit Britain? Because there are those who say we're basically going to leave, it's going to be all right, or are you rather down on it at the moment?
Well, of course, at the moment, the odds are that in terms of a deal that prioritises jobs, living standards and the economy, not looking great. And this threat of turning Britain into a kind of giant tax haven, which would mean gutting public services, I think is something that should chill everyone. And I think this is the point. If British politics now is simply going to be about our relationship to the European Union, rather than say, I don't know, that we've gone through the longest fall in living standards since the 19th century, that squeeze is going to come back by all predictions. The housing crisis, the lack of good, decent, secure jobs, which is why many communities voted to leave the European Union because they felt that they didn't, their communities they'd lost control of. We could go on, education, the National Health Service, as Sonia points out. So Labour does need, I think, and this is its task ahead, is whilst trying to keep its electoral coalition together, which is divided over the European Union, to have a clear, compelling, coherent alternative on all of those issues and try and shift the debate a bit so we're not just talking about the European Union for the next 50 years at this rate. There are other things going on in our country that need to be addressed.
It doesn't always seem like it. Owen, Sonia, Tom, thanks all.
I've been